All right, so we're going to look a little further at the Broadleaf Library with Onyx. And what I have open in Maya right now is a relatively simple scene where I've got a terrain geometry that is emitting particles, and the particles have an instancer node on them, which is selecting from all of these trees that we can see are in the outliner, which are all from presets from Onyx that have been exported. And so right now I have on my particle object, if I select it, there are 1100 particles on it. And so given the resolution of each of these trees, we can see that we're ending up with 252 million polys, but via instancing. And so it's not actually 252 million polys from a RAM perspective, so it renders with no problem. And if I open up the render view, we can see what this render looks like. And so basically I've got physical sun and sky, so just a single directional light with final gather, a little bit of volumetric fog as we can see back there, and it looks kind of cool. So with this scene, if we just take a look at what's going on, if I rewind to frame 1, we'll see all the trees disappear because they all are emitted off of this surface. And this is something that's just, let me just zoom out a little bit, and let me adjust the clipping plane on this camera. Is something that I just made a simple polyplane and just used the poly edit mesh sculpt geometry tool. So it's kind of like ZBrush in a way, where I could just in Maya sculpt the geometry. And so I just sculpted this simple terrain, and I don't really need to worry about the details or resolution of the terrain geometry so much because it's all hidden by the trees. So it's just something for the particles to emit off of. And so with this geometry, if I go under Dynamics and go to Particles, Emit from Object, then it can emit particles. So just like all the instancer particle stuff that we did in the Grass and Instancer DVD. And so this plane I can see has an emitter node on it, and that's connected to particle 1. And then this instancer node called instancer 1, if I go to the attribute editor for it, we can see has 15 trees on it because it starts at ID 0. And so we have these 15 trees, and then they're randomly selected from. And so if I go to the persp and select my instancer, I'm going to set the level of detail to bounding boxes. And if I rewind and hit play, I can see all of these trees pop up. So they're displaying in bounding box mode, which just basically means that the scene is going to be interactive. And so if I go to my other camera, we can see that even though it's 250 million polys, I can tumble around no problem. Obviously, if I want to see the geometry, I can go to the instancer node and switch it to geometry mode, which will then display all of the trees. It's just going to get really slow if I try and tumble. So it's just a matter of switching your level of detail when necessary. And so that's how the scene is set up. And so that calculated, and then there we can see some trees. So every time I rewind and hit play, I'm going to get a different layout of all of these trees. And with my particle object, my instancer, I can randomize the rotation and randomize the scale, and obviously randomize the ID of which piece of geometry is being used. So that's the scene setup. So it's really easy to create something like this, meaning that creating this render is just a matter of exporting some trees, assigning some shaders that I already have, and getting the geometry to emit particles and hitting render. So it's really, the scene setup for this is probably no more than a couple hours. So, and if you already have exported a big library of stuff, then it goes even faster. So the larger your library gets by using paint effects and using Onyx and creating trees and bushes and plants and grass and all that kind of stuff, it can go really quick. But the main thing that I wanted to show is that, with Onyx, the issue of the fact that, you're going to end up with maybe higher poly count trees with Onyx than you're used to with paint effects, it's really not a big deal because you can render them. thanks to instancing. And later on in the DVD, we'll look at proxies as well, which allow you to go way beyond 250 million polys into the billions of polygons. But with that said, what I want to do is just take a look over in Onyx at where these trees came from, and then we'll just do a quick refresher on setting up the rendering settings in regards to physical sun and sky and the MIA materials that you want to use for your trees. So if I just take my scene and let me just get it back to bounding box mode and rewind to frame 1 so the scene gets really light again, we can see in here the trees that I exported, but we're going to open up an earlier save. So let me see if I can find that. So Onyx B03 is what we just opened. So I think B02 is before I created that terrain. Yeah. And so in here, I just have these exported trees. So we can just take a look at the trees that I chose to export from Onyx. And so if I select all of them, we can see it's about 3.2 million polygons worth of trees. So this one is 278,000, 400,000, 300,000, 200,000. But it totals out at 3 million. And with my machine, which has 12 gigs of RAM, rendering 3 million polys is not a big deal. And so when I use the instancer, I can make as many copies of these as I want, and it's not really going to increase the amount of RAM being used. And so that's what's so cool about instancing. So if we take a look, we can see we have a bit of variety as far as these trees, but they're all presets from Onyx. And so if we go back over to Onyx Bamboo, so let me launch that real quick. All right, so now I'm in Onyx with just the default tree. If I jump to Maya and take a look at some of the trees that I have in here, some of these are from the Boardleaf Library, some of them are from the Bro7 library. So meaning if I go to load parameters and we go up, we have we haven't really looked through all the folders yet, but we have the aquatic series, so you can see just using the arrow keys some different types of plants, so some seaweed, which would be cool for underwater scenes. We have a bush library, which we'll take a look at a little bit later because it's useful. Fantastic trees, which just shows some examples of how creative you can get with Onyx, because some of these are pretty neat looking. So like if I open that one up and get that to draw, you can see it's a pretty cool looking tree. And let's go back to load parameters. So a lot of the trees that are in here are just invented, meaning that they're not necessarily based on a real type of tree, while under the Boardleaf Library, most of these have some basis in reality. So I just went through the library, grabbing trees that I thought were cool. They're all cool in their own way, but I just kind of went through and grabbed a bunch of them. So you can see if I go in here and I see one called African Sunrise Tree, and we can see what that's looking like. If I go over to Onyx and try and find it, then that one is in Bro7, or Bro Tree 7, African Sunrise. So if I hit open, switch into wireframe mode just to force it to draw, I can see what this tree is looking like. And so for it, like a lot of them, you can see that the stems are off. And so like I mentioned, a good idea to go over here and go to stem length and put the stems to 0 if you're not going to use them. And then one by one, I just save model as OBJ, hit count, put the twigs to polyline to lower my count down, and under plates, number of P objects to 1, resolution to 1, a little bit of convexity. And then you can see my poly count jumps up to 400,000, which I don't really care about. Like I said, it's just not a problem. I can go in here and be like, well, branch 3 is potentially really small, so maybe branch 3 could also be polyline. That would shave almost 40,000 polys off the poly count. But either way, that's pretty much what I did. So I didn't really go in and tweak these a lot. So Downy Serviceberry. So we can see that one's 420,000 polys. And so just showing some of these different trees. Mahogany, which we saw earlier with wind animation. Tilia cordata. And you can see that all of these are coming in with their own scale. So I didn't really adjust the scale on any of these. Some of these you'll notice, let's say like this guy, this ficus tree, has kind of a wonky trunk inside here. This is something that comes from Onyx, which of course you can adjust the settings in Onyx for that. And so because if we go over to Onyx, you'll see over in the trunk, you have control over the trunk molding. And so that's what's going on inside here. So this tree right now doesn't have that. So it's just a matter of, you can go in and start playing with the settings. And now you'll see that by increasing the mold width and the mold angle, that now we have some detail in the molding of the trunk. And so I can lower the width down so it's not quite so deep. And I can adjust the angle so that you can see they're very, very tight together, or a little bit more spread out, but a little bit deeper. So that is something definitely that on some of the presets you might want to adjust, because if I jump back to Maya and I look at something like this tree, that's just a little harsh and looks silly. While this tree over here, you can see has mold width and some twisting on it, which also looks a little bit wonky. So for each one of the presets, you might want to make some adjustments to the trunks. And again, that's just in your trunk mold settings. And then of course there's also spiral. So you can see that if I spiral that up, what happens? So if I put the spiral to 0, then it's just going to be nice and straight. So a little bit of spiral can be cool, but some of these presets, as we can see, like this one, it's just a little weird. So that's just hopefully when you look at some of these presets, it makes it a little easier to understand what's going on with them and what you might choose to change. So anyway. So I have a whole bunch of presets that I exported. Some of these you can see it's like tree V1, A, B, C, D. For these I took one of the presets, which again, if I just go in here and hit cancel, tree V1 is one of these bro trees. And you'll see it's just or I thought it was, maybe it's under fantastic trees. Yeah. So there's some cool trees inside here, and if you find one that you like, so let's say we like this one, so tree V18, I'll get that to draw. That's what this one is. So tree V18, and you see I have A, B, C, and D, and that's because I made some variations on this preset, and so I like the preset. I just wanted to have some, let me just get that to draw, variations on it. So I exported it once, but then you can go to any one of these parameters and you'll see at the top it says random seed. So if I choose to just put any number in here, just kind of like with Paint Effects, you can see it's now randomizing the main trunks or branches coming off the trunk. I can go to the branches and randomize the branches as well. And then on the trunk, I can also introduce some random behavior in the trunk. And then on the leaves, I can also randomize the distribution of the stems and the leaves. So basically, it's very, very easy to create variations on a single tree. So again, just going in here, going to the trunk and the bow, and I'll just go and play with these settings until I have one that I like. And if I feel like, well, this branch right there is emitting a little bit low, then on your tree, you can see the bottom height is set to 2%. And so I can raise where the bottom of the tree is, or the bottom of the bow branches, and I can raise those up a little bit. So you can see this branch is starting to go a little bit higher. And then I could go down to bow density and lower it, and then potentially get some more of those bow branches to pop up. So it's going to take you a little time to get comfortable with all of the attributes in Onyx, but like I said, I'm not really going to go one at a time expecting it to stick, because the best way to learn anything when it comes to button pushing is just to sit and play with each one of these to get comfortable. So I'm just trying to focus on the sort of core techniques and strategies you want. So you can see now I have a variation of this, and if I look at that trunk down there and I'm like, the mold on the trunk is a little exaggerated, so I can zoom in on that. And then I know that for the trunk, I can go to the trunk mold, and then we can see, well, maybe I want the mold angle to be a little bit larger, and the mold width not to be so strong, and the spiral to be lower. And so now if I just go in here, and let's zoom out, you can see now the trunk of the tree doesn't have that intense molding spiral on it. So in the end, I'm using the library with Onyx. I'm just randomizing some of the settings and making little tweaks to make them a little bit more what I want. And then as far as the leaves go, I've mentioned that you do obviously have control over the size of the leaf, which we can also adjust when we export the OBJ, as we've seen. Just one thing I want to point out that's really important is you have a button here called Phyllotaxy. And if you click on it, it's showing how the leaves are growing off of the twigs that they emit off of. But there's a checkbox in here that makes a very big difference to how your trees look, which is called Sky Sensitive. And it's something that when we did Paint Effects trees, we talked about quite a bit, and very often we turned on Leaf Face Sun, which was an attribute in Maya that goes from 0 to 1. So that's kind of what this is. And if I turn it on, you'll see now all of these leaves are facing the sky. If I turn it off, you'll see they're not. So a lot of trees and plants do that. And so as you're trying to create your own trees with Onyx, this is a very important attribute to be aware of, Sky Sensitive. So off, you can see they're kind of all oriented in random directions, but turn it on, and you can see how very, very clearly they're all orienting themselves to be facing the sky. So there you go. So just by making a few little changes, we have something that's similar to tree V1_8. It just has a few basic tweaks that I've made. And then of course, one of the last ones I'd probably do is take the stem length and put it to 0, so I don't need to waste polys with the stems. Although the twigs I'd probably want on. So because again, if I zoom in here, I can see with the twigs off, I get some floating leaves. Although the twigs on this tree are really, really short. And so I could potentially also put those twigs to 0 if I wanted to. So, because it's really when your twigs are very long that it's more noticeable. So if I go to twig length, you can see it's only set to 5 centimeters. So if I set my twig length to be 50 centimeters, now obviously the importance of the twigs being displayed is much more important. So I could go in here and curve all those twigs down, and you can see now very quickly they're falling with gravity, and we have quite a different looking tree. So, but let's go and adjust that and get the length of the twigs back down to something really short, and now we're back to this tree. So we have the trunk, the bow, B1, 2, and 3, the twigs, no stems, and the leaves. So going back to Maya, I exported a whole bunch of trees. So that's what we're looking at. So the next thing has to do with rendering. So aside from going through and playing with the library and playing with settings, once you export a whole bunch of OBJs, you want to get them into Maya. And the first thing, like I've said, is to obviously just take them and group them together. And you want to group them together, right when you import them, so that if you move them back to 0, 0, 0, they go to the origin. And that's very important to me just because of instancing. So because when you instance geometry onto particles, they do it based on the object being at 0, 0, 0, or at the origin when it's at 0, 0, 0. So these trees can be moved to wherever I want them to be, but as long as I put them to 0, 0, 0, and they go to the origin, they will instance correctly onto particles. So you'll see that if I select all of these trees in here, and I put all of them to 0, 0, 0, they all go to the origin. And so that means they're instancer friendly. So you import them, you group them together. Like I've mentioned, you want to make sure in the attribute spreadsheet under render that you turn visible and reflections on and visible and refractions on. And then once you've done that, you're ready to set up some basic render settings. So that's the next thing we're going to do. So I'm going to just do a quick chapter just reviewing how to set up your physical sun and sky and your MIA materials for trees and leaves, stuff that we've done quite a bit in the last DVDs, but we can do a quick review. And then we'll move on to a scene with all of these onyx trees that is the one that had the little highway in it, so we can look at some of the scenes set up in there. And yeah, the only other thing that's in that scene is I do have some onyx bushes, and for that, that's also just broadleaf, so I guess I might as well mention it now. If we go to load parameters, there's a folder called bushes, and so I just exported a whole bunch of these bushes to Maya as well. And so bushes like this are relatively easy to make with Paint Effects, to be honest, but it's nice to have a library. And so because they're all unique in their own way. And so while I could take the time to recreate something very similar to all of these or almost identical in Paint Effects, it's just nice to have a start point. So if I open them, or open one of them, and take a look at what this bush looks like, we can see the main thing with it, and let's change our background color so it's a little bit easier to see. We can see it has a whole bunch of start point branches inside there. And so this is something that allows you to create something that looks more like a bush. And then some bushes have leaf face sun and some don't. So a lot of these bushes in here you'll see under the phyllotaxy will have sky sensitive off, but I can always go and turn that on just so I can see or get that kind of behavior. And then I can very easily make it a very different type of bush by going to the leaf type and going from miniature leaves to maybe small leaves or to medium leaves. You get the idea. And then of course, as I go in and make these changes, I can always go and randomize the seed value to get other bushes that are like this one, but just a little bit different. And of course, I can go in and adjust density. So if I increase the distance between branches, I can also do this inside here with the bow density, which is right now at 1 centimeter. So if I put that to, let's say, 2 centimeters or 5 centimeters, you can see it's just not quite as dense. So I definitely recommend browsing the bush library because there's a lot of useful stuff in here. Alrighty, so with all of that said, we've got trees and there's bushes as well. And so let's just do a quick review on mental ray rendering with trees.